The Invisible Kingdom by Rob Ryan. As the young prince grew older, his timetable of lessons grew busier. Every minute of every day was filled with his training to become king. His meals became a lesson in correct table manners. Walking down the corridor became a lesson in deportment. The only time the prince really had to himself was when, at the end of another long day, he said good-night to the bodyguard who kept watch outside his bedroom door. All day long this was the moment he looked forward to. That hour between getting into bed and falling asleep was the only time he could call his own, and every night he would lie still and return to his thoughts to an imaginary place of his own invention. It was a small village, a few streets and houses surrounded by fields, which in turn were surrounded by rolling hills. Returning there night after night, the prince had populated this place with a cast of characters. He had made up whole families. He had decided where they lived, worked, and shopped, and even what they ate for supper. Cocooned inside the curtailed walls of this grand four-poster bed, he would pretend he was taking a stroll down the high street of the little world he had created. As he walked along, he'd call out "hello" to all the people he passed, and they all in turn would turn to him and smile and say hello back. One day, the prince had a wonderful idea and asked the bootman if he could borrow one of the pens that wrote the invisible letters and also one of the special torches that revealed the pen's secret markings. The bootman went to his stock cupboard and handed them to him. "But don't you want to ask me what they're for?" "No," said the bootman. "Even if it's for something really secret?" asked the prince. "Especially if it's for something really secret." "But you told me the secrets of the boots." The bootman replied, "I know that people need something to call their own. Even a king who can, at the click of his fingers, command anything he wants, any time he wants it, needs to have something that truly belongs to him alone, even if it's only a dream." That night, with the special pen, the boy began to draw the village from his imagination all over the curtains that draped around his four-poster bed. Every night from then on, before he settled down to sleep, he would carry on with his work, drawing a house or extending part of a street, and then, when he was tired, he would get under the sheets and, using the special torch, he would look up at the world he had created. As weeks and months passed, the pictures on the curtains slowly grew and grew. One night, after a satisfying hour of drawing, the young prince was admiring his handiwork when he noticed that a small section of the curtain that covered the top of the bed had slightly come apart. Through this gap he could make out what looked like a small door handle. With the help of a few pieces of precariously balanced furniture, the young prince climbed up to investigate. It really was a handle, and when he turned it and pushed it upwards, a small door opened. As the prince stretched up to look inside, everything at first appeared to be pitch black, but as his eyes slowly got used to the darkness, he could see that he had found a room, quite tall and wide and very, very long. He had accidentally discovered the long-forgotten attic room. As the years went by, the entrances that led into the attic had one by one been closed, sealed up, plastered, and painted over. Gradually, people forgot that the attic room even existed. In all the stories Lord von Dronus had told the prince about the history of the palace, in all he had learnt about its architecture and artifacts, no one had ever mentioned this magical space that ran uninterrupted all the way around under the eaves. With a glow of pure pleasure, the young prince realized that up here in the dust and the dark, was a place that he could truly call his own. As he tentatively groped his way through the darkness, he decided he would make a map and work out exactly which room lay directly beneath each part of the attic. Besides his nocturnal adventures in the attic, the young prince's busy routine went on as usual. However, as time passed by, the mood in the palace began to change. When the king married the queen, he was significantly older than her, and when their only son, the prince, was born many years later, he was already an old man. Now, sadly, he was not only old, but he was also very ill. One afternoon, the prince was summoned to see his mother. In the presence of the queen and her advisers, he was officially reminded of the importance of loyalty and tradition, as well as his duty and his only destiny. The prince understood the real meaning of this lecture. It meant his father was dying. Never before had the young prince felt so empty and alone. As he walked away from the Queen's office, the palace, with all its grand splendour and beauty, had not one kind word of comfort to offer him. He cried himself until he found that his feet and his tears had carried him down to the basement room that belonged to his friend, the bootman. "My father is going to die, and I don't want him to," he blurted out as he burst into tears and heavy sobs. The bootman put down his brush and did something that no one in the whole of the prince's life had ever done before. He gathered up this poor lonely boy and gently held him in his arms. When the boy had finally stopped sobbing and shaking, the bootman took out a handkerchief and wiped away all of the prince's tears. The king's health continued to deteriorate. Every day the young prince asked Lord von Dronus if he could visit his father, but every time he was put off with yet another excuse or told, "Perhaps tomorrow." The prince came to realise that he had never really known his father. His royal duties, his studying and writing had taken up all the time they could have spent together, and now time was running out for the young prince to ask him all the questions that lay unanswered in his head, such as, "What were you like as a boy?" and "What have you been writing alone in your library all these years? And what do you think of me, if you ever think of me? How can I be a good king?" Every single night throughout his father's long and final illness, the young prince climbed up into the secret attic room and, using a diagram of the palace that he had mapped out, he found the spot up there in the darkness that was directly above the room his father lay. Although he could neither see or hear him, he felt comfort in knowing he was as close to his father as he possibly could be. The prince would bring a blanket and his torch, and he would sit up there all night, whispering down through the floorboards to the room below, "You are not alone. I am with you." The day finally arrived when the prince was summoned to see his dying father. As he entered the king's study, the thought struck him that this would be the first time that they had ever been alone together. A small bed had been moved into the library, and as the prince approached it, he saw not a mighty king, powerful and imposing, but a weak and frail old man who was gradually fading away from life. As the young prince knelt down beside him, the king tried to speak, but all that came out were wheezing gasps. This scholarly, bookish man, who throughout his life had surrounded himself with millions of words, now didn't even have one he could share. The ailing monarch, with such great effort for such small task, pulled out from beneath his bedcovers a large, ancient-looking key, and, trembling, pressed it into his son's small hands. Just at that moment, the doctor came into the room. The boy quickly hid the mysterious key in his pocket as the king fell back into his pillow. The doctor came over to the bed and listened to the king's heart beating faintly. Then he turned to the young boy. "It's late. Let him rest now." The young prince kissed his father gently and quietly walked out of the room. When he got back to his own room, he took the key from his pocket and examined it. It was quite rusty, but he could read these words engraved along its shaft: "My child, do not fear. I will always be here." That night he climbed up into the attic once again to continue his vigil in the dark space directly above the room where his father lay sleeping. As he sat there under his blankets, the young prince started to cry until his tears overtook him and he couldn't stop, not even if he wanted to. Tears because he realized that soon his father would die and he would have to be king himself, a person he never felt he was or ever could be. So many different types of tears, and when he realized he wasn't crying for his dying father, but really he was crying for himself, he cried even more at his own wretched selfishness until he was utterly exhausted. But that same night, the saddest of his life, he lay up there in the dark, unsure if he was awake or still in a dream. He saw a faint light hovering in the middle of the room, like a twinkling star shining from 1,000,000 miles away. The young prince stumbled up from the floor to investigate this strange hovering apparition, and as he stood directly in front of it, close enough to reach out and touch it, he realized that it wasn't a star at all, but a tiny window, no bigger than the smallest button on the cuff of a shirt. Leaning forward and peering through it, he saw leaves and branches, and beyond them he could see the rooftops and towers of the great city sleeping in the cold light of early morning. Taking his torch from his pocket, the young prince saw that the tiny light was actually just a hole in the middle of a window that had been covered up with layer upon layer of thick black paint. Seeing a small clasp on the window frame, he unfastened it and tried to pull the window up, but it wouldn't budge. The paint had been plastered all over the window and had been set in a shut-tight position. He tried again, harder this time, and with all the strength he had. For a brief moment he felt it shift ever so slightly. He tried once more. The paint cracked and parted, and the window flew up and open. The dull glow of early dawn flooded into the room. The first time in over 100 years, that fresh spring air and light that had travelled all the way from its home on the sun had reached that dark, forgotten place. The leaves of the tall plane tree pushed against the palace wall as the boy peered out. The feeling of incredible excitement at this monumentous discovery was soon overtaken by one of panic as the young prince realized that it was morning, and that if he was not in his bed, he would be in big trouble. Quickly closing the window, he rushed back into his bedroom as fast as he possibly could. The next day brought sad news. During the night, the old king had died. The hush that descended on the palace through his final days was now replaced by bustling activity as preparations were made for the funeral. The crowds that gathered on the day of the funeral were immense. Every street round the palace was packed with so many people that the funeral cortege could not even begin to make its way through them. An improvised gangplank had to be raised above the crowds, balanced on the spears of the palace guards so that the coffin could be carried over them. As the body of their king passed above them, the people gasped in pity at the solitary figure walking behind the coffin with his head bowed low. How brave, how noble, how tragic, the crowd thought. Seeing the swords and guns and uniform of war all around him, the young prince remembered the gentle old man who had loved books and words and peace, and he thought to himself how much his father would have hated all of this. As he marched slowly behind his father, He clutched the old rusty king in his hand and chanted under his breath, "My child, do not fear, I will always be here. My child, do not fear, I will always be here." As the only child in the entire palace, the young prince had never felt as if he really belonged or fitted in anywhere. But now he had become very much the centre of attention. Though the government decided that his mother, the Queen, would carry out his royal duties until he turned 18, the day after the funeral, the prince was crowned king. He was 13. As he sat on the throne, his feet a long way from the floor, through hours of ceremonies filled with proclamations and declarations, it looked as though he was solemnly taking it all in, but really he was thinking about the window in the attic and everything that lay beyond it. Every day since his father's death, the young king's mind had been filled with thoughts of escaping from the palace through the secret attic window. Every single night he went up through the trapdoor above his bed to go and look out over the city. He felt the cool air blow across his face, enticing him, inviting him, and daring him to leave the palace. Finally, one night he climbed up into the attic, not wearing his pyjamas, but a dark hooded sweatshirt, dark trousers, and dark running shoes instead. He opened the window as wide as it would go and stepped out onto its ledge. He stopped for a moment, as if he were addressing the whole city, or perhaps the entire country. He declared, "All of my life I have lived according to the needs and demands of others. As far as they're concerned, I had but one destiny. That moment when they placed the crown on my head and claimed me as their property forever. But they were wrong. The moment of my destiny is now. This is my coronation. This is my crowning." And as he launched himself into the night and flew through the air with his arms outstretched, he shouted, "God save the king!"